a great privilege to welcome you to our survey of the Protestant Reformation. In our program, we're going to take you from the very beginning of the Reformation with Luther and show you how lives were changed, churches were spawned, and cultures were redefined and strengthened and forever marked by the power of the gospel that will bring us all the way to the American shores. This event that happens beginning in 1517, we celebrated on October 31st as Reformation Day, begins with Luther's nailing the 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg. It was an opportunity to debate the question of indulgences. Little did he know that what he was doing was exploding a powder keg that would change the shape of Europe and the modern world and postmodern world to this very day. Now you might be asking the question, why in the world would I care about church history? Anniversaries come and anniversaries go, and what really matters is living in the present. But you need to understand, the scriptures themselves teach us to be students of history. Listen to Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 7. The writer of the Hebrews tells us, "Remember your leaders, those who spoke to you the word of God. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever." In those classic words from Hebrews 13, we are commanded to learn from the lives of those Christians who've gone before us as they taught us the Word. And so in our study, we're going to take you to some of the greatest teachers of the Word that God has raised up in the history of the church. The Protestant Reformation, following that principle of the Bible as the authoritative Word of God, was fashioned by teachers who taught people through catechisms and reforming movements to be absolutely faithful to the Word of God. And so in our study, we're going to take you to the Luther lands, to the place of Martin Luther, and we're going to learn about his life, his struggle, his hope to understand how he could find a God of grace, and his rediscovery of justification by faith alone as taught by the Apostle Paul in the Epistle of Romans and Galatians. We're going to see how that beginning with Luther begins to work its way out in other contexts. Just a few miles away across the German boundary into Switzerland, there was another reformer studying the Bible by the name of Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich. And we'll see how this man also went back to the Bible. He found in Luther's ideas a common spirit, but he saw things differently. And we began to realize with the doctrine of the priesthood of the believer, every man studying the Bible with his conscience before God, sometimes different conclusions would be reached. And so between Zwingli and Luther, there are differences. And as that story continues, we'll discover the second generation of reformers will wrestle with what they've learned from Luther and Zwingli. And so a young John Calvin will come also to a Protestant faith. We'll find as we study Calvin that one of his great works were the Institutes of the Christian Religion, a book that's been translated in languages around the world and is still read and studied to this very day. The life of Calvin left a permanent mark as we find a distinction between Lutheranism and the Reformed faith. And Calvin will give the Reformed tradition its clearest exposition. And from that tradition we'll find other great reformers that will begin to take root and spread their faith throughout Europe and then throughout the world. And so from Geneva we're going to see how the Reformation moves us into England and Scotland. We'll find John Knox crying out, "Give me Scotland or else I die," bringing about the Presbyterian tradition from Scotland. We'll see how the Protestant reformers in England found their roots in Luther and Calvin and other Swiss reformers. And we're going to see how they were willing to lay down their lives as they stood boldly for a reformation of the church that took on a distinct form. We call it to this day the Anglican Church, the Church of England. It was Protestant, but it also kept some of the traditions of the Roman Catholic Church. And that becomes part of the Reformation tradition as well. We're going to find that as these great heroes of the Reformation come before us, that there are those that disagree with their movement. There will be heretics and heresies that will come on the scene. Of course, the most famous is that Spaniard, that MD by the name of Miguel Cervantes. And we'll realize that as he confronts the Protestant teaching of Calvin, that he will be guilty of a capital crime and he will be burned at the stake. And this then becomes one of the great beginnings of another reformational fruit. That is, what is the freedom of the conscience? How can a person go to the Bible and study it on his own and be able to teach it to others without being persecuted? And so we will find as the Reformation story unfolds that the Roman Catholic Church will persecute Protestants. But so Protestants will end up persecuting those that disagree with them. And so the Puritan tradition and the Pilgrim tradition will leave England and travel to America. And here in New England, in America, they will establish their congregational tradition. And they too will persecute others like Quakers and people who don't fit their tradition. And we'll come across an individual who is actually remembered on the Reformation Wall in Geneva, a man named Roger Williams in America, who establishes the first safe haven of religious liberty. He takes views that were not consistent with the Puritans of New England, and he establishes his Providence Plantation in Rhode Island and gives the birth of religious liberty. And so as America is formed, one of the reasons that many people leave Europe is to find a place to have freedom of conscience. They came and established their own tradition. Maryland was originally a Catholic settlement. We know in New England there were Congregationalists. Virginia, Jamestown, was a place of the Anglican tradition. But in Pennsylvania, there was a city established by a Quaker, and William Penn establishes religious liberty in a city where brothers were to love each other, Philadelphia. It's in this city where Presbyterians came. They were so taken by the power of religious liberty that they literally changed the Westminster Confession of Faith to follow the practice of the freedom of conscience. And so we see that the story of the Reformation is very powerful. It changes the way people look at one another, at the way they look at government, the way they look at church, at other churches and other traditions. And as this story unfolds, you are going to see their experiences worked out on location through various scholars who tell their stories, and how that message of the Reformation was changed, how it developed, how it was transported to the New World, and how it took root in America. So the message of the Reformation continues to be relevant today as we discover why the Protestant movement was able to take on the Roman Catholic powerful church and shape a new church tradition, and yet in the process ultimately giving us one of the greatest freedoms we know in the world today, religious liberty. So come with us during this time to see the beauty and panorama of the great geographical sites of the Reformation, as we see people who are willing to suffer for what they believed in, and how they boldly as heroes stood for what they knew to be true from the Scriptures, and how the world we know today was created and given birth. What a wonderful way to remember those that taught us the Word of God, to imitate their faith, and to celebrate a tradition that will last as long as the Bible itself.